Good morning, everyone. My name is Duke York. I'm the Deputy Director in charge of Roads and Engineering for Tuolumne County. We got a speaker here today, Rich Muhl from the State Regional Water Quality Control Board. We got Jim Garventa on camera and going to film it for Channel 8, and we'll be showing those. Do you have those times, Jim, by any chance? No, not yet. Okay, well, we'll be posting when those times are. I know Desiree has already worked them out. In the back of the room, you've got, let's see, donuts, bagels, grapes, orange juice, and the coffee's brewing. Is that right, Dave? It's a much better color than the first batch. Yeah.
Our YouTube channel as well.
Or your U2 channel?
YouTube channel, so we own that.
Okay. YouTube. Sorry, the hearing aids. There we go. Okay. Rich Muhl has been doing this speaking engagement. We were doing the math. We figure about 16 years putting together this program and making it available to the public at large. Going to go around the room and do a few introductions in just a moment, but how many counties do you represent, Rich?
We don't assign counties anymore, so I flew it all over. So now I go all the way from Colusa to Stanislaus and all Napa, Sonoma. I'll go anywhere in our region, which is anywhere from Colusa down to Stanislaus and all to the upper ridges on both sides. So I get pulled all over the place.
I'm also going to have him speak towards the end about the commercial and industrial permits and what some of the triggers might be for that. And as we were walking over here, he was explaining that some of the other duties that he has now been assigned are dealing with these fires and the aftermath of the fires in terms of the water quality issues that you get as the rains hit some of these fire areas up in Santa Rosa and Napa and Sonoma. So, beginning right there, go ahead and introduce yourself and say which project you're associated with.
Tom Russell, Lawson Associates, with the construction management firm on the new Tuolumne County Jail.
Behind him?
Matthew McNichol, environmental planner with the San Francisco Public Schools.
Okay.
Aaron Rasmussen, Columbia College, Forestry and Marine Resources.
Jason Penrose, Columbia College, Forestry and Natural Resources.
Okay.
Rachel Van Columbia College, Forestry student.
Excellent. How did Columbia College hear about it? I'm curious.
Crystal recently sent out a posting that come here for class. It's the third month.
We're certainly glad to have you here. Glad to have you. Go ahead.
We accepted live also in Columbia College. Amber's the best on both.
Lonnie Carter, Senior Building Inspector for Tuolumne County.
John Snelling, building inspector for Tuolumne County.
I'm out Lake Maintenance Man.
Ruben Chantal with Lions Culture.
Brian Eaton with the Tuolumne County Engineering Road.
Gaddy Alina Pay, Tuolumne County Road.
Dave Ruby, Civil Engineer with Tuolumne County.
Warren Palacios, Tuolumne County Engineering Technician.
Tonya Allen, I'm supervising engineer with county. Renee Hendry, I'm a planner for Tuolumne County.
Where are the rest of the planners, Renee? Oh, you're taking notes. Okay, we're covered. Okay. Okay. With that, I'll turn it over to Rich Muhl, and I'll get the lights, Rich.
Okay, cool. So if you guys have specific questions regarding forestry or what we do on some of the fires or whatever, I'm happy to answer those at the end too. I don't know if you will, but we work closely with the counties on trying to assess where life safety might be and some other issues. So I can talk specifically about that too. And we work with both CAL Fire and some other agencies. So my name is Rich Muhl. I'm a senior environmental scientist, as Duke kind of talked about. I've been doing stormwater now for 20 plus years. And so I'm a stormwater specialist primarily, so I spend most of my time out in the field addressing issues and trying to deal with some of the problems. So I'm going to talk about a number of different things today. I'm going to talk about some of the issues we saw during the 2016-2017 wet season, some enforcement examples, possible reasons for some of these BMP issues, types of enforcement. I'm going to quickly go through that for anybody that's doing construction. Talk a little bit about erosion control BMPs, which are also applicable to forest practices, and sediment control BMPs be the same type of thing. And then good housekeeping and waste management, some of the other problems that we had. So I'm going to start off with the Dollar General store. This Dollar General store, I'm going to go through a whole bunch of series of projects that had enforcement. Everything I'm going to talk about now had some sort of enforcement. A lot of these had administrative civil liabilities, which I'll talk about a little bit different, or a little bit later, but it's $10,000 a day, $10 a gallon is the way we calculate them. So this is a Dollar General store. I was working in Jackson, and I was kind of barking at a guy because his site looked pretty bad. And he basically said, well, if mine's bad, why don't you go up the hill? And I said, where? He goes, I'm not going to tell you, just go up the hill. It's up Highway 88. So I had to keep going until I ran into this. But when I saw it, it was pretty obvious what was going on. So this is what it looked like when I got there. They really had no BMPs. They had some silt fence and some fiber rolls. And that's essentially all they had. You can see they got silt fence, but the silt fence is on the slope. You never want to try and put silt fence on a slope. It's going to fail if you try and do that. So, and this is a risk level 2. In the construction general permit, there's risk levels. Risk level 1, risk level 2, risk level 3. Risk level 2s and 3s have to have both erosion control and sediment control. Risk level 2, no BMPs, bare dirt, they're still working the ground. Now this is during a rain event when I was up there. It's raining right now. And here's another picture of what it looked like. I went and talked to the superintendent. Basically, I said, when are you going to install BMPs? He said, whenever I'm done. I said, yeah, that's not the way the permit works. So I explained it again and to him in some detail and tried to get him to comply. We use progressive enforcement, so we always talk to the person, try and get him to do the right thing. If that doesn't work, then we find other ways to get him to comply. So this is kind of what it looked like when I was there. It really started raining hard. It was kind of horizontal rain type stuff. It's pretty high elevation. You can see they had a light application of straw mulch, but not much. And so there was a lot of erosion going on. You can see my truck in the background down there. So it's a big site, it's 5+ acres. One of the things they did in the silt fence is they didn't put a J hook or anything at the end to try and capture the flow. So what it did is the silt fence just directed the water right off the site, and this now it became a gully. So now they're dumping onto the Caltrans right away. It was so bad that Caltrans maintenance was there 4 or 5 times a day for 2 weeks. So they were barking at me about, hey, can't you make them put some BMPs in? So it was a problem. The other thing that happened, I talked about putting silt fence on a slope. What it did here is a good example of it. You can see it just undercut the silt fence. A silt fence is not going to work in a concentrated flow. And so all the sediment just blew out. They got a fiber roll in there, which is kind of a token thing. It didn't really do much. So I did my first inspection, talked to the inspector, or talked to the superintendent, and basically said, hey, you need to deal with this issue. This is just what it looks like kind of on a discharge. Here's the way it looked on the street. And it goes into a culvert, goes under the road, and goes directly to a creek channel. So I came back about a week later. Site looked exactly the same. No, didn't make any changes. I mean, I think they probably tried to put some rocks on some of the fiber rolls to weight them down, but that was about it. Looked virtually the same. You can still see the silt fence. It's kind of hard up here. I don't know if we can get the front lights off or not. No, that didn't work. Is that better? Okay. So you can see the silt fence. This was an early morning inspection, so the pictures aren't the greatest. But you can see there's still sediment going under the silt fence. It looks exactly like the last picture. And you can still see the sediment down here. So about 2 weeks later, I did a follow-up inspection, and now they installed BMPs. Now they've got all these BMPs. They've got basically blanket everywhere on the site. They put way more blanket than they probably needed. But you can see the whole thing is blanketed. So what happened is I wrote them a notice after my first inspection, I wrote them a notice of violation. I sent them the notice of violation. they were basically warned that they needed to comply. After that notice of violation, they had a follow-up inspection. They still hadn't complied. So what we did is we wrote them a administrative civil liability. This one was for $55,000. So not a huge amount. We're using more. There's two kinds, and I'll talk about them later. There's two kinds of administrative civil liabilities we have. We have the full version, and we have a compressed version. The compressed version takes the major violations and adds those in. And the way our permit works, it's $10,000 per day per violation. So that's kind of the way that the whole thing's set up. And so that's kind of what happened. And then we set out a press release. This is a bridge project. I was doing this particular project. I was coming back. I'm going to put this over here. I was coming back from up in the foothills. I was wet. I was pretty tired, and I just wanted to get back to the office and dry off, frankly. And I did this project because I thought it would look really good. Turns out not so much. I was there for like 5 hours. So what happened is this is what it kind of looked like when it flooded. So when I first got there, it kind of looked like this. They had a low flow pipe. Does anybody work on bridge projects? Familiar with? So you kind of know what I'm talking about. You have to have a 401, you have to have a 404. This is in a creek, so obviously, it's waters of the U.S., so you have to have all those permits. Typically, you dry out your work area, and then you work in your area, and you have a method to keep it dry. In this case, all they had was the low flow pipe. They have this black pipe, which is a low flow pipe. That's all they had. They didn't have any mechanism for pumping high flows over the work area. So when I got there, I saw immediate problems. You can see the blue hoses. The blue hoses were pumping turbid water out from inside the work area directly downstream to the creek. So that's a violation right away. But there were more issues going. I was up at a higher elevation. It was pouring down rain. I knew the creek level was going to come up. It always happens. It's going downhill, right, down the mountain. So I knew that was going to happen. And I said, what are you going to do? Do you have another pump? He goes, we don't. What do you mean? We don't have a plan. So that's kind of what I got. So I suggested strongly that they go rent a pump or try and do something. But eventually what happened, before that, and they also had the excavator working down in the creek. So they're trying to pull off the false work so it doesn't float down the creek when it floods, because now they're anticipating it's going to flood. So it's raining. They're running back and forth through the creek channel in the rain. And you can see they don't have on the upper right-hand picture there, they don't have a downstream dam. So the grousers are creating a turbid water right there, and they just got this kind of mud hole. Well, what happened as advertised, the water level started coming up, and I'll show a video at the very end of this, what it actually looked like. But you can see that on the upper left, it started breaching the dam, and then breached the dam, and then finally flooded through the entire site. And the dam was it was just rock with plastic on it, so it was seeping like crazy anyway, so it wasn't a very good construction for trying to dewater a work area. I don't know why they didn't use sheet piling or something else, but at any rate, this one also received an ACL, and it was just kind of a no-brainer. I couldn't do much about it. And what made matters worse is one of the guys that was working there said, well, this is actually the second time this has happened. So that didn't help the situation either. So that, that was unfortunate. But everybody learned. This particular bridge contractor, I've had him on a couple other projects now I'm working on this year, and they're much better. So I think it was a learning curve. And this is kind of what it looked like. Eventually, I had to crawl back over the false work because I realized I parked on the wrong side of the creek. And so I had to try and crawl back over everything to get back to my truck. So it was an interesting day, but a lot of water goes through that creek during high flows. Another project where you can see they sprayed it with erosion control. As I said, for risk level 2 and 3 projects, you have to have both erosion control and sediment control. If you have a risk level 1 project and you're around Sonora, you still need erosion control. You got to have erosion control around here or it won't hold up in the winter. So you really still need them. It isn't required by the permit, but in order to really control your site, the sediment on your site, you're going to have that too. But in this case, what they did is they basically sprayed it with a light application of some sort of erosion control. I don't know what this was. It wasn't bonded fiber matrix. Whatever it was, it just completely reeled out. It didn't hold up. This is a fairly high elevation, but irregardless, it should have held up better than this. The other thing they forgot about, as you can see in the lower picture, they forgot about where all the water was going to go. It was going to go down the paved driveway. It's paved, right? So it can shoot straight down the driveway. So all the water which later, when it was done, makes a lot of sense. Not so much during construction, just ran down the road, down to a creek, passed my truck there, down to a creek, and created all kinds of problems. And in the lower left, you can see how much sediment actually ended up on the roadway. Crazy amount of sediment. It was like, and so that in itself is a problem. Another site that got an administrative civil liability from us, a fine. This particular one had really poor housekeeping. In addition, they just didn't install any erosion control BMPs. Again, it's a risk level 2 site. They had all kinds of persistent issues. We talked to them multiple times. The county went out and talked to them, different county, not Tuolumne. The county went out and talked to them multiple times. The county wrote stop work orders against them. They still decided not to do it. So we wrote them an administrative civil liability. This particular individual has been fined by us before for a couple $100,000. So track record isn't going too well right now. But you can see that all the sediment, if you look at the upper right-hand picture there, all the sediment that was around that drain inlet. So that had been going on for a while. It wasn't, didn't just happen overnight. And the bigger picture behind everything, you can see there's just really no erosion control at all. Did Ham broadcast some straw, but it isn't going to do much. And then you can see my sampling bottle, and this is down by the creek where it went into the creek. Typically, we always sample. In this particular inspection, the QSP, and there's a QSD and a QSP that are on construction projects. The QSP was actually their sampling, and we got the same numbers for our turbidity readings, and we all agreed on everything we saw. And so that was kind of interesting to do sort of a joint. We did them separate, and then we came back and just sort of shared our results. Here's another project. Got a lot of slopes to this one. Long linear project, a lot of slopes, open ground, right before a predicted rain event. This particular project, I went out and did the inspection. I thought it would look good. Took a look at it. There were a lot of problems. Went back, talked to the superintendent. The superintendent hadn't walked out there yet to take a look at what was going on. But you can see a lot of slopes, a lot of issues. One of the things that happened here, there were some sediment control BMPs put in place, but no erosion control BMPs. And so what was happening, it was just blowing over the top of the sediment control BMPs. So we got long runs, so you've got a lot of the water's really going to get moving. The other thing that happened, you can see it rilling down on the upper left there. You can see it cutting through. It's cutting. And then there's some rock bags. There's some BMPs in place. There was a small basin, but not enough to really stem the flow of water coming down the hill. One of the other things that happened on this project, and I'm talking about this because it's a good training of what sort of some issues that can happen, is the road was compacted, which is what happens when you compact a road? You get more runoff or less? You're going to get more. And so what happened, the storm drain system went active just a couple days before that too. So now what happened is a storm drain system, which is now active, picked up all this water and shot it down the hill in more of a concentrated flow, which made it much worse than it was before because it just sort of sheet flowed off the site. So that's one of the problems. And then you can see big slopes, really no BMPs. On the bottom, you can start to see the rilling. Once it gets rilled out, it creates a lot of problems. Now, this particular one got buttoned up eventually, but in Sonora particularly, we've had a lot of problems. If you get behind, it's really hard to catch up if it keeps raining. Once the ground gets saturated, you really can't rework it, and that sort of is the problem. And this is kind of what the discharge looked like down into the creek. So we always walk down in the creek. We always take discharge pictures. I've got a video at the end that kind of shows what it looked like too. Actually, the videos of some silt, of it going through a silt fence, but a lot of sediment moving down towards this stream channel. One of the other things we saw last year on some of our larger projects, because I work in such a large area, people trying to trap water in their road cuts. Road cuts aren't engineered, so it works maybe for a while, but it's not going to work long term. So one of the things we saw is they would capture it in one road cut and then pump it to another road cut. And anytime we start seeing these big pumps all over the site, we start getting really nervous because eventually you can't handle all that water if it keeps coming. This particular site is it's Amazon, and it's in Sacramento. They got an enforcement action from us. But this is a big site and they really never dealt with a run-on they had. They had a lot of run-on coming onto their project, which they really should have tried to divert around it, and that would have helped their situation because they were dealing both with the water that fell on this large site as well as the run-on coming onto their site. So if you have a facility or you got a project and you have run-on, try and get the run-on around your site. Don't try and deal with it on your site. And this is a good example of that. The other thing we saw is a lot of advanced treatment systems going in. They were going in everywhere. Advanced treatment is kind of when you can't do anything else, you've got to treat all the water, you've got to reduce that turbidity level. Sometimes you have to reduce the pH. And so we saw a lot of those type of things going in. This is a big system. This was at Amazon eventually because they couldn't do anything else. They just had to treat all the stormwater. The other thing we saw is I don't think do you use lime treatment a lot around here? Do you treat with lime? Okay. It's pretty rocky anyway. Down the clay soils they do. So I want to talk a little bit about the type of enforcement we have at the regional board. So we have verbal warnings. So anytime I'm doing an inspection and I see something that's probably not going to work, or I think it might not work, I'll say something like, you might want to take a look at that portion of your project. I'm not sure that's going to work very well. You might just look at the BMPs, or if the BMPs aren't maintained, I'll say, hey, you probably need to maintain those BMPs. They're not going to hold up. That's considered a verbal warning. So that goes into our stormwater management database as a verbal warning. The other one that is more informal, we don't do staff enforcement letters, but we will do notice of violations. A notice of violation will compel the property owner. All of our enforcement goes to the property owner, which sometimes gets confusing because they paid the contractor to do the work and all of a sudden they get this notice of violation and they're not even sure what it's for. So you want to communicate with them if something happens too. But we send them a notice of violation which asks them to do a bunch of different things. It could be to add additional BMPs, to provide a class to their subcontractors. It could be anything. It just depends on the situation, kind of what we require. So our penalties are $10,000 a day plus $10 a gallon, but $10,000 a day per violation. So for every violation, so in that first one, the Dollar General store that I showed, that they had $50,000 the first day I was out there. There were 5 separate major violations, so that was $50,000. So obviously they add up really fast, so you want to try and stay off our radar. If a regional board inspector or municipal inspector or county inspector in this case comes along and says, hey, you need to fix this, you need to fix it, because they'll talk to us and we're often aware of some of those problems. That to us is a verbal warning already, and so we're quicker to go to enforcement. And the other thing we have to do that I want to talk about is we have to get the minimum amount of economic savings. So there's a savings in not installing these BMPs. You don't have to put BMPs in, saves you money. We have to at least calculate the minimum amount of economic savings in our enforcement so that discharger has to pay for that plus whatever the penalty is. And sometimes that adds up pretty substantially on some projects. Formal enforcement, again, cleanup and abatement order is where we ask somebody to clean it up and get rid of it. So, for instance, in Tuolumne County several years ago, someone built an illegal dam. They had a friend that came over and basically traded him a case of beer for building a dam in a creek. About 5 days later, the water level in the creek came up and washed the dam away. It wasn't engineered, it wasn't constructed properly. I don't think it was compacted either. So it all washed down into the creek. We wrote them a cleanup and abatement order. He had to go in and clean it up, which they did, and had to restore it, had to get permits through U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the whole permitting maze of stuff. At any rate, that got cleaned up. That's a cleanup and abatement order. A full administrative civil liability is the larger, where we're taking all the violations from the time we saw, first time we went out there, to whenever it got solved. We're taking all the violations per day for the whole time. Streamlined ACL is what I talked about earlier, where we're kind of taking the major violations, we're adding that in. Though we can use either one of those. Joint enforcement with the Department of Fish and I need to change my presentation. It's Fish and Wildlife now, or the US EPA. I do a lot of joint enforcement with the wardens and Fish and Wildlife on a lot of different things. Some of my cases also get referred to the district attorney or the circuit prosecutor's office, and some of them go to the attorney general's. Those are the larger ones. We've had some fairly large ones recently. So what were some of the issues? They're kind of the same issues we have every year. Not installing sediment control BMPs, not installing erosion control BMPs, not installing BMPs prior to rain events, and not maintaining the BMPs. That's the other thing throughout the year. There's kind of two seasons. The first half of the year, we try and get people to put them in. And then it seems like after Christmas or New Year's, we try and get people to just maintain what they put in because they're wearing out. Stormwater BMPs don't last forever, so you have to sort of go in and maintain them. So, you got to make sure they're still functioning. And that's why there's inspections. There's a requirement to do inspections in the permit. Good housekeeping issues continues to be a problem. Anytime there's a facility or a site project that has bad housekeeping, I don't know if that's good English, but bad housekeeping, then what we'll do is we'll stop, get out, walk around, because we always find other problems. We also get good pictures for training, but incomplete rain event action plans. There's a requirement in the permit that 48 hours before a rain event, you have to do what's called a REAP, rain event action plan. And basically what you do is you write down, there's a predicted rain event, greater than 50%. Here's what I'm going to do to stabilize my site. And then you go out and implement it. A lot of times the REAPs aren't being done. pH issues on lime treatment isn't not up here, but in other areas has been a huge issue. Concrete washouts continues to be an issue. If you can, just send the concrete back to the batch plant. Just say, just I don't want you dumping it here. I don't have a washout. Just send it back. You can recycle it when you get back there, if you can. That's the best way to do it. If you're too far away, that's not going to work. Then you're going to have a washout. Flooded sites, turbid offsite discharges, and multiple permit violations. Now, what we did this year, because there was a lot of rain, if folks had BMPs, and even if they were working fairly well, we just kind of said, yeah, I don't know, you probably just keep working with it, see if you can figure out what's going on. That's kind of what we did. We tried to go after the low-hanging fruit, and that's what we always do. We go after the folks that aren't installing BMPs. So if I'm working in an area, if I'm working in Sonora, I'll drive around Sonora, I'll get a sense of what everybody's doing. If I go by a site and they have no BMPs or really poor BMPs, that's who I'm going to go after. So a lot of times I'll drive through, we do around about 180 or 90 construction inspections that we actually put in our database. We probably do closer to 200 or 300 because we drive by a lot of sites. They're fine, they look really good, we just keep right on going. So we're watching a lot of the sites that are going on. The other thing is we constantly talk to the municipalities to try and deal with some of the issues too, and to try and help them comply, help with their compliance. And the difference between what the regional board requires, I want to talk quickly about that, is that we have a general permit, which means I don't care what you use. You should try and use like a good BMP, but I had someone years ago that someone dropped off a couch. He had a discharge going in the storm drain. He had a bunch of other problems upslope. Someone dropped off a couch, so he took the couch cushions and he threw them in front of the drain inlet, and they actually worked really well. I'm pretty sure that it wasn't the county spec for what they wanted, but it worked really good. I thought it was kind of innovative, so I was okay with it. But whatever you got to use to try and control stormwater, the sediment coming off your site, we're okay with. Yep. Duke?
Our solid waste division really wouldn't care for that. Keep going.
No, I know. Well, he got rid of the couch. He had to throw the couch in his dumpster anyway, so at least, he was like, well, I may as well utilize it. Here. So possible causes. We sat down and kind of thought, well, what made this happen last year? There was a bunch of different things. New construction personnel and the shortage of subcontractors. I'm not sure up here, but I know in the foothills, but I know down in the valley, there's hardly any subcontractors. A lot of them are untrained. There's a lot of building. There's just not a lot of trained personnel. A lot of the people that really understood stormwater when the economy kind of took a downturn left, and they've never come back. And they're off doing something different. So a lot of the highly trained people, or people that were trained previously, are gone, and we've got a new crop of people coming in that need training. So that's why I do a lot of outreach. This is my third class for this week. I've done three. This is the third class I've done. So we do a lot of public outreach. We do a lot of training, and to try and bring the level of just expertise up. Stormwater is not black and white. Anytime you try and control sediment on any project, it's not black and white. It's really shades of gray. You can put a BMP in one place, install it the same exact way, works great. Take it to another site, do it the same way, doesn't work at all. So You know, you really have to look at your project. You have to kind of fine tune it. It takes a little bit of time. It's not really an exact science. It's kind of, some people really love it. Some people really hate it, and because it's just difficult. The other thing that I think happened is there were a lot of people that weren't used to the wet season and heavy rains. We've been in a drought for a long period of time, and we're fully aware that a lot of people just sort of gambled. They tried to install minimal BMPs, and in the past they've worked. But this year it rained a lot, or last year it rained a lot, and it didn't work. If we get a lot of rain this year, it won't work again. Again, lack of erosion sediment control training of the QSPs and QSDs. So QSPs, qualified swept practitioner, they're the people that work in the field on the particular project. The QSD, qualified swept developer, is the person that actually writes the SWEP. There's qualifications for both of them. There's a test you take and all this other stuff. That's all done through the construction general permit. But the QSPs in the field, when the permit was first written, there was an assumption that the QSPs and QSDs would have erosion sediment control training. They would kind of know about it, and they would just take this class, which kind of explained the permit and how to make the permit work and stay out of trouble under the permit, and then that'd work. But what happened is we found out that they really didn't understand the underlying, you know, how to install BMPs, what to do when something goes wrong, how to inspect them, those kind of things. And so that's been an issue that we're going to try and close. There's a new permit that's in draft form right now. It'll come out for public comment, I think, in a couple months. That permit tries to close the gap on some of this knowledge that we have. There's also a lack of communication between the QSDs and QSPs. There was an assumption when the permit was written that, and the state board writes the permit. I should talk about that. There's 9 regional boards. The regional boards enforce the permit. We're one of them. I'm in Region 5. There's regional boards throughout the whole state. The state board then, they do most of the administrative stuff. They write the permit. They do a bunch of other stuff. And because I'm in Sacramento, I work really closely with the state board on some of the permit language, some of their stuff, trying to help them kind of ground truth some of the stuff. But there was an assumption made that the QSPs would talk to the QSDs. So you got a project, it's raining a lot, your BMPs fail, you're not sure what to do. You're going to get on the phone, you're going to call the engineer, whoever wrote it up, the QSD, you're the QSP, you're going to call the QSD and you're going to say, hey, what do I do? Here's a couple pictures of what I have, what do I do? That was an assumption. But what happened is the some of the owners are saying, I'm not paying the person to do that. The QSP can figure it out on their own. So what happened is we had some QSPs kind of out on an island, is what I call it, trying to make decisions to solve problems when they really were outgunned. It was really more than they could handle. And you could see from some of those pictures, those are pretty massive problems that were really difficult to deal with unless you bring in some expert help. And when we're in our office, we're constantly talking about stuff. What do you think? What could we do? You know, what could they do? Because some of it's a shade of gray. I think the QSPs were overwhelmed by the heavy rains and on-site issues, which I talked about. There's a lack of owner understanding of the stormwater program. That's a huge issue. A lot of owners really don't understand what has to be done. They're trying to save money. They're trying to keep the project on a budget. We totally understand that. And I don't want people spending money if they don't have to on erosion sediment control BMPs, but sometimes you just have to do it. There's a lack of also program buy-in from the superintendent and the owner. There's some superintendents that just don't care. And, you know, I mean, that's all right, but that's our job then to try and flesh them out. So I want to talk a little bit about just what to do. So when we go to a construction site, what we want to see, and some ways that you can stay out of trouble. So one of them is if you can preserve existing vegetation around the outside of the project, it's a huge BMP. Even if it's a 10-foot strip of grass. Doesn't have to be a lot, anything. Especially if it's tall weeds, it'll take out a lot of that turbidity or a lot of the turbid water. It'll help filter it. It'll catch a lot of that sediment that's moving around the site. Erosion control is always the key to effective stormwater management. Now, the difference between erosion control and sediment control. Erosion control protects the dirt or the soil from the impact of the raindrops. So when it rains, the raindrop comes down around 20 miles an hour. It's going to hit the soil. It's going to break it apart. and it's going to run, it's called splash erosion, and it's going to run off on sheet erosion typically on a construction site. About roughly 70% of the erosion off a construction site is sheet erosion. So if you can protect the soil from the impact of the raindrop, it's not going to break apart those particles. I have a kind of a cool, it's not in this presentation, but I have a cool slide where it shows the raindrop coming down and actually blasting the soil particle apart. But especially in a heavy rain up here in Sonora, that's what happens all the time. And that's why it loosens all that stuff up, and it just starts, you could see from the pictures, it was just flowing straight off site. So erosion control is always going to be the key. Track walking, you could see some of those projects that I showed had track walking is very, very minimal. What it's doing is the grouser's going up and down the hill and creating these little ridges, so the water has to flow over the ridges. But that's not going to work if you get a lot of water. It'll work like for a real lightweight rain event, but you got to put something on top of it. Straw mulch would be the basic thing you could do, but don't hand broadcast it like this. If you can see shadowing, and for forest practices, we see straw mulch used a lot, but if it looks like this and you can see dirt everywhere, I call it shadowing, that's not going to work. You have to have it thicker than this. If you have dirt, I mean, because when it rains, it's still going to hit those dirt particles and still break them apart, and this is on a slope, so you're still going to have, you're going to get concentrated flow, and you're going to still have a lot of sediment coming off this particular slope. Here's straw. This is on a little larger subdivision. This isn't a big subdivision, but still, this straw is kind of in a good place. And you know, you want it down thick. If you're going to hand broadcast it, about 2,000 to 4,000 pounds. So it should be, you know, it should be thick. You got it. It takes a lot of bales. 3-step hydroseeding with mulch also works. Would be the next step up. You want to make sure you apply it in 3 steps, not all in a slurry. But there's different ways to do it now. The technology for some of these spray-on applications has got really good. It's much better than it used to be. It used to be kind of, it was always okay, but now it's getting much better. Some of these will heal themselves quicker. If there's a break in them, they'll kind of seal back together, stick back together. They do a lot of stuff. But you want to try and apply the seed and fertilizer first, then the mulch over the top, 2 tons per acre, and then the tackifier or glue. A tackifier is a guar or plantago, and essentially it's like Elmer's glue kind of, not really, but it just sort of sticks it down and just sticks the straw in place. So before a rain event, typically it gets windy. So if you hand broadcast a bunch of straw, the wind will come up, and I've seen multiple sites, and I'm sure you have too, Brian, where you know, and it'll just blow the straw on one side of the site, and then you got a bare slope, and all the straw is over at one end. So if you can get it tacked down so it sticks together, that's going to really help you. Blanket, this blanket isn't installed properly, but erosion control blanket is probably the top step. But I got to say, some of the spray-on applications now are getting as good as an erosion control blanket. But here you can see the sagging. If you look right here, you can see where it's bagging out. You have to have a tight application to this. You have to have a tight application to the soil surface. If you don't, you'll end up with all these little holes underneath. And be careful walking across it, because you'll fall on these things. You'll end up with a big trench, and you just fall into it. You can't see it. So that's one of the problems we have. So here's a better application for blanket. A little small. This is along a roadway. I think this is Highway 80, I think. But you can see here, this is a laydown yard they have, but this is a better application for what it is. And some people, geotextile fabric, I see it used around here too, works well too. It's just, you know, you just put geotextile down, you can sometimes reuse it too. So that's another good thing to do, especially if you have clay-y soils with a lot of clay material. It won't pump through it, so that can sometimes help too. And then you can see the fiber rolls on the outside. So what we look for is an effective combination of erosion control and sediment control. So here's a good example. Grass behind, you got that on the front, and then you got the fiber roll. Geotextile fabric and fiber roll. Some people just gave up and went to plastic. Try not to use plastic. It just, it costs a bunch. You got to throw it away later. You end up with more water coming off. In this particular case, they used plastic because they didn't have any other options. But then what they found out is that they had so much water coming off the site, it was overwhelming all their discharge locations. So it created other additional problems, even though it stabilized this little patch of roadway.
Hey, Rich.
Yeah.
That plastic, if you did a big enough application, could you actually end up getting sued for creating problems downstream for adjacent property owners? Because you've modified the basin there.
That could easily be the case, because I know on this particular project, I don't know how much the runoff was so high once they put the plastic in, it created all kinds of downstream problems. So it's possible, yeah. Sediment control BMPs, again, they're going to capture the sediment. Erosion control is going to protect it from the impact of the raindrop. Sediment control BMPs capture it once it's moving around. So that kind of makes sense. You don't want to try and capture it, just keep it locked in place. So they're going to capture it when it's moving around. Fiber rolls, basically fiber rolls, you see a lot of them. There's different kinds of fiber rolls. If you use the wildlife-friendly fiber rolls, you can leave them in place at the end of the project. If you use the netted fiber rolls, you have to remove them at the end of the project. So this staking pattern, this is an old, I'm not sure this staking pattern is exactly right. This is an old photo. But you've got to stake these things down. And one of the things, if you just lay them on the ground, they're not going to do anything. You know, the point is they're round, so you've got to try and make sure that the bottom is down so when the water hits it, it'll actually stop. There's some studies being done on some of these fiber rolls now. In certain applications, you don't want to stake them down really hard. But that, I don't have any, it's all anecdotal so far. But we might see some of that change on some of the applications for staking fiber rolls. But right now, you know, you want to get them down. Fiber rolls come anywhere from, I think, 6 or 8 inch up to like, you can get the big, 24 inch, I think. The big fiber rolls, you can get big ones that replace hay bales too. So this is another type of fiber roll you can actually drive over. There's a bunch of synthetic versions out there. There's Filtrex fiber rolls. There's all kinds of different names. Some of them have compost in them. Some of them have straw. Some of them, there's a bunch of different types. I don't have pictures of all of them, but there's a lot of product out there now for fiber rolls. You just got to take a look at it and see for your application what's the best. Do you want to reuse it? You know, just there's a lot of different things to take a look at. Silt fence is an older BMP, but again, you can't put silt fence on a slope. You should be 2 to 5 feet back from the toe of the slope. And the reason why is you want an area for that sediment to drop out. If you run a lot of water on silt fence, especially on a slope, it's just going to fall over. It's not going to work. And even the wire back, there's a heavy wire back silt fence where it's like a heavy welded wire on it. Even that, eventually, it'll just undercut it and fail because it's not a dam. It's not going to hold long term. And you also have to trench and stake them in. There's a line on silt fence, and you have to get it, there's usually orange or yellow or something, and you have to stake it in at the bottom to that line. If it's not going to work.
Hey, Rich?
Yeah.
On that silt fence, the back, how much accumulation should you allow before you go back in and maintain that silt accumulation?
What is your spec? Do you have a spec for it?
No.
So
I have the same diagram you have, but I don't think it states what the...
It doesn't. I mean, I would do it when it was like half full if it was me. I mean, because if it puts pressure on the silt fence, it's going to fall over. Silt fence doesn't last forever either, and you know it'll break down. The UV rays will break it down. So when you first install it, it might work pretty well, but towards the end of the winter, it's not going to be working too well because it's been out in the weather and it's cold, and you know.
Another problem with that, if you're trying to clean the silt out from behind it, it doesn't take much from the shovel to tear it, and now your silt fence.
Yeah. Silt fence isn't my favorite BMP, and the reason is I read a study 4 or 5 years ago. For every $1 you spend buying the silt fence, you spend $1 in maintenance. So it's a high maintenance thing because you got to come in, clean out the sediment. Half the time, if you're using wood posts, you have to restake it because the posts snap off. And unless you're going to use T-posts, if you're using T-posts, now you got to. So I mean, there may be some applications it works great. Other applications, I'm not sure it works so good. It's an older BMP. I mean, I think for a barrier, it works well to keep people from driving through. There's certain things, you know, that it works for, but some things it doesn't. The other thing I talked about is you don't want to concentrate the flow on a silt fence like at the top. You want to have it so it sort of spreads out the flow because if you don't want to put pressure in any one location. Tracking on roadways. I mean, I just went by a couple sites when I was coming here this morning. They had a lot of tracking. They're doing some haul work up in Angels Camp, and they've got some issues going on. And so, you want to have some kind of construction entrance. Obviously, this is a larger project. It's pretty robust. The cool thing about this one is it's got the silt fence. Here's a good example where you would use silt fence. It forces everybody to go over the rumble strips. These metal rumble strips will shake the tar out of your car, but they work really good for trucks, and they'll knock a lot of that sediment off. And so, sometimes you have to make your construction entrance as long as it needs to be to get the sediment off. I had one last year that was almost 200 feet long and still wasn't working, and then they had to put a tire wash in because they just kept tracking on the roadway. It had this weird clay soil, and they couldn't get it off the tires. So you just have to sort of take a look at your site and figure out how big a construction entrance does it need to be. Typically, they're 50 feet, but for some of the projects up here, they don't necessarily need to be that long. So you just enough so you're not tracking on the roadway. Tracking on the roadway, you need to sweep up. That's one of the number one complaints we get is tracking on the roadway. Once it starts raining, the phone just starts ringing, and 90% of the time it's somebody tracked on the roadway. Laydown yards, you want to have a laydown yard. If it's on your project, that's fine, but if it's off-site, right now I'm working with PG&E up on the fires. I'm working on a couple of the different fires too. And one of the things with PG&E is they have all these laydown yards. So I'm working with them to make sure they have BMPs installed, and they do a good job. But make sure they have their BMPs in place and they're taking care of everything. So a laydown yard, you want to have it gravel or something, solid. You don't want to track out on the road every time you go pick something up. Portable toilets, you really don't want these things falling over next to a creek. This one's in more of a production area, but you don't want one. If you on a smaller project up here, don't stick it by the edge of the project by the creek, and don't stick it by the road. Put it somewhere where if it falls over, it's not going to the blue water isn't going to go anywhere because that's kind of bad. And I've done a couple different trainings where I was doing my training, and the guy washed it out and the thing fell over and all the blue water ran right behind where I was doing. It was a field training. It was an interesting moment, but you don't want to do that. The permit requires all stockpiles to be covered. So before a rain event, the dumpster lids have to be closed if you have a dumpster. If you have a 40-yard dumpster, it needs to be covered. If you have a 20-yard dumpster, it needs to be covered. If you have just a little dumpster, it should have a lid. So make sure if you're on a construction project, you have a dumpster with a lid. If you have stockpiles, they need to be covered. If you have like a large concrete rubble pile, they're sometimes really hard to cover. So berm it or something else. But the larger pile, or the pile like this, you need to cover. Washouts, you want to have a washout. You don't want to be washing stuff on the ground. If we see white stuff on the ground, we know folks are washing something out on the ground. So what we want to do is make sure that people have a washout. I think everybody's using this one, but you can tell he's washing his stuff off in the washout, not other places. And then this water needs to be disposed of properly. So here's the 40-yard dumpster that's not covered. This was a $10,000 penalty for not covering this dumpster. And the reason was there was this whitish blue, I don't know what was in it, water washing out the bottom of this thing. And so, that's a pollutant that's coming straight out. It went right into the storm drain, or down in the street when it went in the storm drain. So it ended up, all he had to do was cover it with a tarp. So just like this.
But now, with just a tarp,
It's going to bag in the middle, and it's not going to work very well. So great question, thank you. There are dumpsters with lids. You can get the sliding lid. A lot of people don't like them because the lids jam, but you can get a lid. Or plywood works. Or there's a couple products out there where they have like a frame. They're not very much money. A frame that fits on top of the dumpster. You just actually set it up there, and it's like a kind of a metal frame. And so, there are options out there, but it is an issue with the tarp because the tarp bags in, all the water falls in, and then you're like, why did I cover my tarp? Or why did I cover my dumpster? Because all the water fell in. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I want to see if I can get out of this and show you the video. Okay, I think this one is a silt fence. Let's see if it. Yeah, so this is what happens when you put silt fence in a concentrated flow. It's just not going to work. And in this case, they put multiple layers of silt fence, but it's just, I mean, you can see the water going through it. And you can see the rock bags. I mean, it's not like they didn't have BMPs, because they did. It's not going to work in a concentrated flow. And I've got one more, I think, to show. Let's see. This is what it looked like when that bridge project. This is what it looked like when it flooded. So you can kind of see how I was just standing there going, you got to be kidding me. This is really bad. So, and that little low flow pipe is not keeping up, obviously. So it flooded out their entire site. And the other thing is, really, from a construction standpoint, they had no BMPs on the banks either. They had no. There was a bit of straw, but for the most part, there wasn't anything on either bank either. So they didn't have construction. It's that particular project had a construction permit and also had a 401, 404 permit, and they didn't comply with either one of them.
What county that was
Yeah, it's in Amador County, Sutter Creek, city of Sutter Creek. Yeah. So Duke wanted me to talk a little bit about industrial, I think. And so the industrial, if it's an industrial facility, coverage for under the industrial general permit is based off the SIC code, the Federal Standard Industrial Classification, I think, if I got that right. And that particular code was written by the EPA years ago. Certain types of industries are in there, and certain types of industries are not. I wish I would have brought it with me. I'm not totally prepared for the question, but they have to typically they have to manufacture something. They have to make something. If it's a facility that, let's say they sell, I'll use chain link fencing. So let's say they sell chain link fencing. They don't make it, they just sell it. They would not be covered under the industrial permit. But if it's a facility that actually produces the chain link fencing, then they would be covered under the industrial permit. And so that's kind of the way it works. And there are certain industries that were exempted from getting coverage that have water quality issues sometimes, but don't need coverage. So the best thing if you have a question on should this facility need coverage, is to call Jenna Yang in our office, and Jenna runs the industrial program. And Duke will have my contact information. If you need to, you can send me an email and I can give you Jenna's contact information, or you can just call there and ask for Jenna. And she can answer the question whether that type of industry needs coverage or not, because it really depends on what they do. If they sell steel, they don't, or I'm trying to think of another example. If it's a lumber yard, they don't need it. If they actually mill the wood, they do. If it's millwork, they might. It depends. So there's a bunch of different nuances to it. And certain, but typically that industry category is what it is. If it's a trucking facility, they do washing, fueling, or maintenance. Typically, they need coverage. But there's certain exemptions to that too. So it gets kind of squishy. Nice way to put it. Does anybody else have any questions?
Well, I got a couple I was going to lead off with, but let's do the crowd first.
Okay. Questions on, okay.
I have a question on the REITs.
Yes.
Is that for all risk categories, and where do those plans get filed?
That's a great question. So the question is for Rain Event Action Plan, the REAPs, where do they get filed? They get filed into the SMARTS database, the Stormwater Management Database, and they get uploaded. Typically, they're kept on site and they get uploaded into the SMARTS database. And it's for risk level 2 and 3 sites. Risk level 1 sites don't have a rain event action plan. A risk level 1 site it's based off water quality risk, so they don't have the same level of requirements. But just because you have a risk level 1 site, we had a lot of problems with risk level 1 sites last year too, doesn't mean that you're really not going to have issues. So you might want to look at some of the BMPs that you normally use in risk level 2 and say, I'm going to deploy some of these because I've got issues or going to have issues.
How do you determine, if you have a level 2 site, you just have a max flood, huge amount of rain, which obviously put it in a 3-year boat. Do you give them any leads?
Yeah, well, like I said earlier, so what we do is, okay, thanks. So the question was, if you have a risk level 2 site and we have a major rain event, real heavy rain event, how do we handle that from an enforcement standpoint? That's your question? Okay. So what we do is, if you've got BMPs and they're adequate, or, I've been doing this a while, so I can kind of tell if the particular project has installed pretty robust BMPs. And, then I'm just going to say, wow, you might want to put some more BMPs in or something like that. So we give people some leeway. And that's where I talk kind of about the verbal warning. It might be a verbal warning, or sometimes I just said, just fix it. Just fix it. Because, sometimes I go to a site and I'll say, I think that'll work really well. And then it fails miserably. So, and then other times I'll say, I don't think that's going to work at all, and it works really well. So, sometimes I'm as confused as everybody else. Because again, it's this shade of gray. It's not very black and white. And normally the contractor, the superintendent, will know their site better than I do. So I really do rely on them to say, hey, what happens when it rains? Where's the water coming? What goes on over here? Why don't you have so I rely on them to sort of tell me about it and sort of walk through it. So we'll try and help them. We can't dictate means and methods, so we can't say, here's what I want you to do. But I'll try and steer them the right way. You need more erosion control. I'm really worried about this corner of your project. You got a lot of runoff. Can you divert that around? Stuff like that to try and help them sort of solve the problem on site, particularly if it's a QSP that is, I feel like, has got more than they can handle, or just it's a really difficult site. And there were some super, super difficult sites last year. All of those, except for Dollar General, were really difficult, and then Sutter Creek one too, but the rest of them were really difficult to manage. And it wouldn't have been easy no matter what they did. So.
I've had the conversation with different contractors. If you get over a certain amount of rain in a 24-hour period where if things go bad, you're not liable for it
No.
Isn't there
No act of God clause in the,
if you get X amount of rain and now you're discharging, even though you had BMPs and everything in place?
So the question is, if you get extraordinary amount of rain, even though you have BMPs in place, is there some kind of just, get out of jail free card, I guess, sort of, or? Yeah, no. But what happens is when it's raining really hard like that, I'm typically out running around, and I just don't enforce. If everybody's flooded out and everybody's having problems, I'm going after someone that doesn't have any BMPs. I'm not going to go after someone that has BMPs because they took the time to think about it. They took the time to install it. They took the time to maintain it. I'm not going to go after them. I'm interested in what's happening because it's good to watch that stuff just to see what works, what doesn't work. It's raining, the type of things that happen. So it gets if you like this business, that's when you want to be out when it's raining because you can really sort of see what's going on. So I like that part of it, but we typically don't enforce. There were several times last year where, wherever I was working, everybody was having trouble. It was just a question. Then what I would do is I'd identify who out of the 7 sites I went to, was there any low-hanging fruit? Was there somebody that was way down here? And if there was, that's who I went back and enforced on. And even then, if it rains that much, there's not a lot you can do until it sort of dries out. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Is there separate permitting for disaster relief?
There is, like fires you're talking about?
Or fires or anywhere, is it a national?
On this last series of fires, the governor sent an order out that waived most of the state permits for fire zones. That typically happens with some disasters. I think it depends on the disaster. We still require some permits, but but I think some of those may be exempted. I can't talk about that specifically because I haven't got guidance yet, but typically the answer is yes. It's the same permit, but sometimes the rules get relaxed.
Well, this last year's storm event, some of our staff was noticing that there was a handful of QSPs out there that weren't quite on the ball. We dug a little deeper into some of them weren't even qualified as QSPs, but were working under the licensing QSP. We're in a situation where in our industry, special inspectors aren't following through with their jobs correctly. We can remove the job site and request somebody who's competent to be on site. I guess what I'm asking for is there some kind of training you provide to enforcement staff to identify if they're doing their job correctly and they're reporting correctly, and is there an authority that we have for QSPs to say, look, we don't want you on site anymore. Get somebody outside here to competent and job done. We have the authority as a county to enforce that.
So the question is, if you have a QSP, I'm trying to restate your question. So the question is, if you have a qualified SWEP practitioner that's inadequate, and there's a bunch of them that don't understand the rules, that can you remove them from the job site? And there probably are, in this case, is it the QSP or someone working under a QSP? They're working under a QSP. Okay. So if it's if it's a qualified SWEP practitioner that's not doing their job, let me know, because I can deal with that directly. And they're required, there's a minimum set of standards, and the state board takes that pretty seriously, and what we'll do is we'll check that out, because then they need to either go back and get more education or just quit doing it. The current permit allows someone to work under the QSP. So the idea was that the QSP, who hopefully is knowledgeable, will train someone under them to then do their inspections and do the other stuff. That hasn't worked out so well in some areas, and I think that's what you're running into. And they're really, in that case, what I typically do is just enforce, and that's when I talked about in my notice of violation where I require them to do a class. That's what I require them to do, is basically take a class on erosion setup control and what they're supposed to do. So I would be more than happy to train your staff on what to look for. I'm happy to do that, and come back and talk about that. And I can show you some slides, and we can go through. I have a couple case studies where we had a QSP that actually falsified information, and I can talk about that. I can talk about some of the things. I had a situation in a negotiation with one of these administrative civil liabilities where the QSP did a whole bunch of stuff wrong, and the owner finally, during this negotiation, looked at the QSP and said, this is your fault. You're paying for part of this. And so it cost him a big chunk of money. So when I'm doing QSP, QSD training, I constantly talk about the fact that you're liable here, guys. If something goes wrong and this owner, gets a major fine, you could easily be paying some of this unless you really make sure that you're doing exactly the right thing. The new permit kind of raises the bar a little bit, but if that's the case here, I'm more than happy to help you any way I can to root that out, because, we're only as good as the people we have in the field. And those QSPs and QSDs are really the first line of defense that are supposed to be helping you, the county, with making sure the site looks good. And if it doesn't, then that's not working at all.
What do you think about the more, they're hired by the owner?
Yep.
So it seems like their interests are leaning towards the owner, not leaning towards the client.
Always. And there's always this push to try and save money and to, and I get it. I came from construction before, I started. And so, I understand all that. So, but you know what? It's about water quality, and you got to do that too. And sometimes on some sites, it just costs a lot. It costs more. If you're trying to work in the winter, you're going to spend a lot more money than if you try and do it in the summer. It's just a known fact. And so if you can finish your project up in the summer, you get it buttoned up, you'll save a ton of money.
Before Getty out, last question, and then I've got a couple and we'll wrap up.
Okay.
Along that same line, I'm wondering how often does either a QSD or a contractor or somebody just say, look, this project's really big, let's just build it in phases, or let's only build in the summer, or just don't build in the wet season?
That's starting to happen. That happened a lot when the economy downturned and people were getting in trouble. A lot of people said, you know what, I'm just going to do this in phases, just like you said. So the question was, do people build in phases? But now what we're seeing down in the valley anyway is massive projects going all at once. But what they're doing is they're deploying advanced treatment. So they're immediately saying, I know I've got a problem. I know I'm going to have an issue. So I'm just putting an advanced treatment system in, and I'm doing other BMPs in addition, but I'm relying on that advanced treatment so I can keep going.
I'm going to use the microphone.
Sure.
Briefly. A couple of things. One of the questions that I'm going to have deals with the multiple offender provision and whether there is a multiplier on the fines when you're dealing with somebody who has multiple occasions. And you mentioned one of the offenders had that.
Yeah. That's a tough question to answer. I think, yes, but it depends. It depends. Every situation's a bit different. So theoretically, if you had multiple violations, that the penalty would be higher. The opportunity for you to use our streamlined ACL process probably goes away if you have too many violations, and then it becomes a full-on thing. And when that happens, it becomes a really big dollar amount. Some of these, we had one we're still working on, which was $1 million for Kirkwood. And so some of these are really big. They get big really fast, the full ACLs.
One of the more interesting facts is that last year, when we went to what we call the pre-winter meeting, where we talk about construction, we talk about the effects on the roads, you got Caltrans, Forest Service, a lot of people there. The prediction that came out from NOAA, National Oceanographic and
Aeronautic Association, is that right?
Yeah. They came out with a prediction that there was a 1/3 possibility of less than normal rainfall, a 1/3 possibility of normal rainfall, and a 1/3 possibility of above normal rainfall. Now, I think I could have made that weather prediction. That was last year. And what we got in Sonora was the 5th largest runoff in the county's 130-year history. This year's rain prediction from NOAA is 1/3 chance of less than normal rainfall, 1/3 normal, and 1/3 greater than normal. So, act accordingly. Just a couple other things, Rich. In the training program, because a lot of us have gone through that training program, as you well know, the QSP, we took the test, but then there was this second test that was supposed to be done, or second certification. Are they still doing that, or have they simplified that process to try to get more people qualified?
So what Duke's talking about, there is an underlying certification. So in order to be a qualified a QSP, you have to basically take a 2-day class, and it's taught by a trainer of record, a TOR, and you take that class, which is about the permit. It's about the permit, about different components, and then you have to have an underlying certification. So there's a bunch of different certifications you can get, a SESQI. There's a whole bunch of different certifications, and you have to take that test too. That test is pretty basic, but if you understand erosion sediment control, it's pretty basic, but it's a separate certification. So when they wrote the permit, they wanted everybody to have this underlying certification. And in the new permit, there potentially may be, we gotta be careful what I say, there potentially may be some additional language that allows an off-ramp if you take a certain class. But that's not for sure, and it's draft anyway, so I don't know how it'll come out. Again, the new permit is all draft, and when it's draft, you never quite know how it's gonna come out. But right now, that is still in place, that underlying certification.
I have had copies of the sign-in sheet. Well, we'll get to you, Tanya, there. I got copies of the sign-in sheets if anybody needs them for the records. Also, Rich, legally responsible person. That issue comes up quite a bit because you got the QSP, the QSD, and you have the legally responsible person. You want to...
And you have the data submitter. So you have a data submitter too in SMARTS that actually is allowed to put data in. Legal responsibly party or person is the person that's actually responsible for the project. And that's essentially where that, if we do enforcement, where that goes. So the LRP has to be somebody he has to be the owner of the company or the owner, the owner of the property, or it has to be someone that is legally responsible for it. It can't be the contractor. And sometimes owners try and get the contractor to sort of say, why don't you be the LRP? But we try to keep that from happening because then if we do enforcement, it goes to the contractor. The contractor doesn't even own it. And so then we're going to figure that out, and we're still going to go back to the legally responsible party. But then it becomes this third-party loss, this lawsuit between the two people. And so it has to be someone substantially in charge of the actual facility, the owner, the president of a company, and the county, someone at the county that's top of it. It has to be someone like that. Does that answer it?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm actually gonna, hands off on that.
Sure.
For that LRP or that owner, when they are doing a contract to hire a QSD or a QSD, what type of aggregate insurance should they be looking at for any of these litigation suits that come through?
I'm not sure. I'm really not sure how to answer that. Yeah.
If you've ever seen like minimum requirements of like a 2 million aggregate or any of that.
I haven't, but I haven't been on that end of it, so I'm not an expert in that part of it.
I'd like to thank Rich Muhl for coming and to the presentation. We are going to have it on Channel 8. We will have it recorded on a disc, so it will be available if somebody wishes to, that couldn't make it, wanted to view it, they can. We do that every year. And the dates that we will be showing it will be made available. One of the subject matters, and Rich, with 1 hour you can only cover so much of this, but one of the things that you may want to also research, and sometimes I've asked Rich to talk about it, is post-development. There's a big push now as part of that SWIP plan is you have to deal with post-runoff, you have to deal with on-site retention detention. These systems are not cheap, they're very expensive, but they're very necessary as well. And this dealing with that post-runoff quite often is a science all unto itself, and it is very complex in terms of the calculations that you have to provide and show how that's going to be handled. So again, I want to thank Rich Muhl, and let's hear it for Rich Muhl.
So if anybody has any questions, Duke's got my contact info. Just let me know. Even if it's like I have a friend of a friend that has a project, that I don't care. I mean, it's really, for me, it's about water quality. And so that's why I do this job. So I'm happy to help you any way I can. And sometimes people, sometimes things are easier than you think if you can, get some guidance and help. So